This is the Emery Go-Round Task Force meeting. And we will start this, and I assume Sabrina will be joining us shortly. I know she was in a meeting with somebody.
It's just me with John Quinn and John Gooding and so, that's what she did.
And so Maurice.
Yes.
So we're going to go a little bit out of order. So I will first just kind of give an overview of what we're going to try to get through today. This may be our last meeting. We'll see how it goes. If not, I don't think we'll probably need to have more than one additional meeting. I think we're very close. And if we are going to try to make that date of going to council on April 22nd, then this does have to be the last meeting. So we are going to do an update on the Transportation Management Association meeting, and Maurice is going to give an update on the Powell turnaround, and also really for information, a couple of comments, but not for in-depth discussion. I did provide everyone with a copy of the route ridership analysis that the TMA completed and presented at their last meeting. Interesting things in that. And as part of that, I also presented, this was a budget that they did in February. That was a revised budget based upon looking at an increase in service to meet the ridership capacity issues that have arisen during the route. And that's not necessarily the same as the route analysis. The route analysis is actually proposing some changes in routing. This budget is really just adding buses to the existing route. The main part of this meeting is to look at some of the revenue options that we've been working on, and there's some interesting information, I think, to chew on about that. And so that is really what I'm hoping today that will be the focus of the meeting, to get to some, if not consensus, to some feelings of what people feel about some of these revenue options. And the next steps, as I said, hopefully next steps is that this committee's work is done. But if not, I think it should be finished in one more meeting. So I'm going to ask Maurice to go first so that he doesn't have to simply stay.
Go on his way. He doesn't have anything else.
Okay, so I just want to bring you up to speed on where we are with our experiment that we did 2 Fridays ago out on the peninsula. We're trying to attempt to turn the largest bus around, do a U-turn at Powell and Admiral. And this is essentially a computer drawing template of the existing bus, or the bus making a U-turn at this location. There's another one if somebody wants to. So we received the parameters of the bus from the TMA. And this bus is really big. It takes about an 84-foot, 4-inch space to be able to maneuver the bus and make a U-turn. We took that data from the bus and put it into the turning template software on AutoCAD. And our civil engineer was able to show that the turn could be done in around a 75-foot space if it's done in a certain way. And then if we were able to make it work in that way, we could show that there's enough space on the south side of the street to widen the street to allow for the bus to make the U-turn and to maintain the sidewalk next to the riprap that's out there. But I wanted to do this experiment just to confirm, first of all, that our computer model was correct. But secondly, to see whether or not the operators of the bus would be satisfied with it making a maneuver in that way. And it showed, so when we did the experiment, we had to post no parking. We had to tow about 6 or 7 cars in order to make the experiment go forward. We knocked on doors to try to figure out if people were home, because we ran the license plate numbers, but unfortunately they weren't, so their cars were towed. So we attempted the U-turns, and it turns out that our modeling was correct. You could do the turn in the space provided. We followed the tire marks of the bus, and it hit the curb just about the spot where we predicted it on the diagram. And it looks like there's enough space to do the widening in the mode that we were showing. However, the operators of the buses were really reluctant to make that maneuver on a permanent basis. First of all, it requires the bus driver to pull all the way to the right of the street, stop, crank the steering wheel as far as they can go, wait for all the cars to clear out. And that's really probably the most important part, that they didn't really want to sit there and have to wait for the chance to pull back out into the traffic. And they saw a number of safety issues with that. And so I feel that I got the results I wanted to prove that the bus template would work. We could do the widening, but it turns out that they're not satisfied with doing it in this manner. So with that, I'm recommending we don't really look at this option anymore, that we've done our homework on this. This is really not something we would want to pursue any further. So the other thing we did was we did an experiment of turning the largest buses in the existing space that we have out there without having to do any widening. And essentially, because they've been making U-turns all along in that area, primarily with the largest buses, they've been going all the way out to the end at the marina and turning around, but the smaller buses have been making this U-turn. My last one.
That's fine.
So our template showed that the bus could actually make this maneuver, and they did it when they did it very carefully. I mean, they have to do it just the right way in order to make it. And so what this shows is some ideas you could do to give more space for the buses so that they could make the move more regularly without as much of a difficult problem. So what the bus operators have been concerned about all along in doing it in this way, and I should say all along since the new operators started taking a look at this, was that they would have to make this maneuver through the crosswalk. It's not against the vehicle code, I'm talking to the police chief, but they feel there's a safety issue there. So, so one of the things we thought we could do would be to give more space, would be to eliminate the new bulb out we just put in, and then we could push the crosswalk back more onto Admiral Drive, take the little nose off the median island on the west side of the intersection on Powell, and then put in a full stop control intersection at that location. What that does is,
When you say full stop, sign or
we would put stop signs up on Powell Street. Yeah, right. So, and you would probably want to have the stop, if you're going to move the stop bar back onto Admiral, you're going to create a sight distance problem. So ideally, all the cars would come to a stop all the time at that point, so that then when vehicles are coming out onto Admiral, they come to a stop where they're supposed to before the crosswalk, and then they're going to end up creeping out into the street as they start making their left turn. But you'd want to make sure that you're not going to get blindsided by a car that's coming through. So that's why you put the stop sign for all the vehicles. But in general, for the operations of the U-turn, if the bus comes to a stop, they would again proceed into the intersection, and then again they would wait to make sure that the traffic is clear, and then they can proceed to make the U-turn much easier than the way they can do it right now, because it's really kind of tight to do it right now. So we discussed these items, these ideas with the bus operator, and they couldn't give me an answer right away as to whether or not they'd be comfortable in making a U-turn if these improvements were done. So we're waiting to hear back from them to see whether or not they could proceed on a full-time basis making this U-turn. The other thing is that if we were to do these improvements, we would have to work with the Watergate homeowners to see if it's okay to construct a sidewalk onto their property. So there's really two hurdles we would need to go through. And then if we get positive feedback from both, then I would recommend that we could pursue some design work. And
So we don't have an estimate for the cost?
No, I mean, we can work that out. I haven't done that yet. But we don't know whether or not we're proceeding with this, so I haven't really put any more time into that. I didn't want to pay an engineer to design it at this point until we know whether or not the TMA and the Watergate would be interested in this.
So Maurice, you don't have to alter something down? What's going on here?
No, you wouldn't have to. They actually could make the U-turn right now.
And
What this does
are there
is,
any
you can
curb
see,
cuts anywhere along?
nothing
here?
on the south side would need to be done. It would be all on the north side. And like I said, they made the turn now. It was really hard to do, but this just gives them more space to do it.
So they can make it just by going into the crosswalk, but you're saying if we take the bulb out and move the stuff, then they'll have to.
Yeah, as you can see, it's really, when they take the turn in this manner, they're
Right
barely
underneath the
missing the
corner,
nose here, and
yeah.
they're barely missing the step,
Yeah.
right? So this just provides them an extra probably 8 feet to do it, right?
Maurice, on the issue of whether Watergate would go along or not, you're talking about taking a piece of Watergate property? Is that part of the bulb?
No, it wouldn't be taking a piece, it would be more extending the sidewalk onto Watergate property, so it would, we wouldn't necessarily need an easement, we could build the sidewalk, and Watergate can continue to own it.
I can't speak for a Watergate official, but as a resident, I don't see how that would be a big problem, especially since the residents really want that service out of their neck of the woods.
Then you'd have the same width in the sidewalk.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds like the easier part. I think the operators signing off on it is the crucial thing.
Most likely, yeah. I agree.
Okay.
Okay,
So that,
So now we need to figure out how to pay for it.
thanks, Maurice.
For the merry-go-round, I mean, not that.
Oh, yeah. This is much.
That's our problem.
Yeah, oh, yeah, exactly. And this would be a lot less expensive and a lot easier to do than to try to widen on the south side, because you're getting to the end of, the edge of the landfill, and it's a lot more costly.
okay.
So,
So the
And
other,
just really quick though, at the same time, we're looking at, we're talking to the marina to make sure that we, if, in the event that the operator says no to this, figuring out plan B so that we can keep the turnaround down at the marina.
Right.
And trying to get something in writing where they say
Correct.
it's okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we've got the letter now, but we have a letter from them right now, and we can just reiterate from them, get some kind of confirmation that they would want this long-term.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can do that.
okay, so the other major issue that the CMA has had, and they had a special meeting around this, is the route ridership analysis. And I gave a copy to you because it was presented, it's a matter of public record, and I thought some of you might be interested. There were some recommendations, but right now there's not the funding in order to really implement the recommendations that would add a route and make some changes to the other routes. And so the budget, revised budget that they passed in February isn't based upon this report. It's really just based upon adding service to the current routes to increase capacity. The other thing too is that this route ridership analysis is really based upon current ridership. A next step could be to kind of layer onto it the development projections. Staff has just revised some of that since we're going to the city council with the traffic impact fee. That as part of that process, the development projections have been revised, and we have a little bit better sense of when we think projects will come online. And of course, to some extent, assuming it remains the same as it is now, what they might generate in terms of revenue. But it also might impact a little bit some of the analysis. I personally think there'll be a little bit more ridership than is now between Powell and around 59th than there is now, because of the residences that are coming online in the next year or so there. So I think that would be a change. And right now, that's a very light part of the line. And what we think is happening is that a lot of Emery Station is not getting off on Hollis, they're getting off the Amtrak station, because depending on where you're working or where you're living, that is a more convenient stop for you than the Hollis stop. So we think that that might change some. But it's something for information. I also think it's, it does address some of the issues that people have had around equity and who's paying what and who's getting service, because there are a few surprises. I think one was that the regional retail, which is really the Shellmound Road, is pretty full all day long. And one thing that was at least news for everyone, seemed to be news for everybody, including me, was that there's 1,000 employees at Bay Street.
Yeah, they actually said,
That's
it appears that the bulk of the traffic on the show, on that route is people who work there.
Awesome.
Because you can see it shift times, like
Yes.
before the place is open, there's a ton of riders, right? So they're coming to work, or-
Yeah.
so,
So that was kind of a surprise.
But then after the shift changes, then the stores are open and.
Yeah, then the
you have
stores
the
fill in.
shopper store
Consistent,
coming
yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But then you got kind of the folks that are working till 9 o'clock and then
exactly.
closing up the stores, they're getting that last one.
It's actually working as designed.
So that was
Even better. Yeah.
Imagine.
but so this, you know, for my benefit, for what I took from it when it was presented to us a week or two ago is, you see where everyone is. It looks like people are using it on the entirety of the route. I mean, North Hollis has riders. I mean, there are riders in places,
65th is one of the big.
you know, so
stops too.
there isn't, I struggled to find an area where no one's getting on, right? Even though there's been some
Maybe a stop
discussion
or
of
two,
that.
but there's not, it's not the route,
Um,
that's the problem, yeah.
And that they said to handle your existing business, it will grow because of additions to the community, but also just people commuting more.
Yeah.
They say you should count on a 25% growth in ridership, and their recommendations were to make that work. We don't have the money to make,
And that
to
does not
implement their
include
recommendations.
the
Yeah,
new developer units that were kind of presented in the
Yeah.
last meeting.
But it
So-
did confirm a little bit what I had said all along, which is that it makes sense to consider adjusting the Hollis non-peak service, you know? Because if Shell Mountain's being used all the time, all day long, all week, you know, 7 days a week, and Hollis is still primarily being used peak hours, then maybe the midday stops don't run every 20 minutes, maybe they run every 30 minutes or.
But you also have some numbers that are skewed there, that are gonna be filled in quite soon with other
Right.
uses.
Right.
And the last thing we need to do is draw back. Quite frankly, what it didn't say as profoundly as it should have is, if we don't continue to grow and increase the
Oh, no,
lines,
I'm with you, I agree.
we're already
Yeah.
falling behind the wave now. When we designed this, the number one rule was reliability. The moment we take that off the deal, you're gonna lose ridership and people are back in cars.
Yeah.
Three other issues that have come up that are impacting this that weren't talked about is Caltrans work. Not only the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, but the Bay Bridge has had a convergence that have created a huge problem of people taking cars. And we haven't even made, quite honestly, the same effort we did 10 years ago to get the employers and the employees to get out of their cars.
Right.
And that's gonna happen more and more in the future as well. So most important besides today is seeing the next 3 to 5 years, not just looking backwards.
I'm with you, I agree.
The last thing I'll say is that, kind of piggyback on that, is that a fair person said that usually transit agencies, to compare us to, they start, if a route gets between 15 and 20 riders, you know, then that's when they start thinking that there's per hour, and that's when you start maybe thinking about making adjustments. None of our routes are ever below 40 per hour.
Yeah.
And they're more like
So,
80
okay.
to 100.
yeah, they're all effectively at beyond.
Yes.
Capacity.
Another agency would add service at the level we
More
are now.
buses, right.
That was
Okay.
really.
Call ref.
Right.
Yes. So that was just interesting too. Okay, so that's really just some information, and I said, I think it's the first layer, and I think that once you start adding the developments that are under construction and approved, you know, you can kind of just see that where the system is in order to keep the folks off the road, keep our traffic congestion down, keep the parking demand reasonable, and, you know, add to the economic health and residential non-angst, so to speak. You know, this is an important service.
Yeah.
So, so move on. So how to fund it, that's kind of what we're really here to discuss. And so there's lots of different pieces. This, again, you're getting the advantage of being at staff level in terms of how we're looking at this as opposed to seeing finalized recommendations. But, so there's a couple of pieces to kind of guide you. One is the revised 2014 budget, which indicates that for this year, the TMA decided to increase service that essentially is a $200,000 deficit. There are reserves enough to cover that if need be. There also seems to be some reserves in the P-bid fund balance that could be used toward that in a couple other places. But essentially, while this deficit can be covered for this year ongoing, even this deficit starts getting dangerously low, their cash fund balance. And then if you look at this little piece of paper, which is their 3-year budget forecast, then you can see that in 2015, you start looking at over a $400,000 deficit, and that really is just to kind of keep the service levels equivalent to what they are now. It doesn't include any of the other changes that were put forward by Barry Pierce.
Can I ask a question, please, Karen? I know you were doing an audit to go back and see whether fees were correlated properly to all the different property owners, and whether in the last couple of years, how much was missed. Is it possible, when you finish your audit and you do see that there were underpayments in that sector, how many years can we go back? Not a lot, obviously, but there should be some fair assessment, even if it's done on a payment plan, to bring that back in to mitigate some of this deficits, so that you don't have outcries from people saying they're being overcharged and not undercharged.
I just finished, NBS, which is the company that has been repealing our property rules, will be reviewing the top 100 parcels, and that's equivalent to about 80% of the revenue, so we think that's a reasonable amount to look at. And they plan to have that information by the end of April, and so they'll be looking for discrepancies going back. If there's something that looks off, they will do site visits if necessary, but between the county and the city. We also are working with them in planning and finance to have a better internal process. Because I think some of what happened is it was a little bit more like, was staff dependent as opposed to kind of procedure role. And so we're trying to get that tightened up so errors don't creep in.
But my sense would be we're going to find at least that 195.
Yes, well, this is where I still need to get our legal opinion, but what I will say is that the management plan allows for there to be protests for going back for 1 year. So my guess is that I doubt that if the protest can be a year, then you can make underbilling, so to speak, for more than a year, but you don't have that analysis yet. Yes.
This is a question from honest ignorance, but we've got 2 business people, one representing a very large contributor, Lauren, a classic smaller business. What kind of a tax write-off can you folks claim for your contribution to a P-bid operation such as the Emeryville round?
I don't think it's different than an expense.
Yeah.
It's a
nothing
business expense,
special.
kind of a standard business expense.
Yeah,
Okay.
So there's not a
there's
unique.
no bonus.
Nothing
No.
unique,
Yeah,
but just a standard expense for doing business in the city of Emery.
Right. But what happens, so you have a little more clarity, is this. Depending upon the type of property, whether you're a small, medium, large business, whether you're a landlord or the tenant, some leases will be gross, some leases will be triple net, single net, double net. So
Big
depending-
variety.
And so depending upon the property, some might be paid by tenants. In many cases, some are not paid by the tenants, they're paid as an expense to the ownership, separate and apart from the tenant, the user.
So there's no simple template that operates. Okay.
Well, but big picture, I think the property owners always figure whether it's immediate or over time. Tenants make choices by total occupancy cost. Businesses, like, I don't care if you call it an expense or rent, I pay dollars to be in my space and operate.
Right.
And even if a tenant's paying it for a couple of years, then when they renew their lease, they say, well, I only want to pay X total for my
Okay.
spot, and if it all goes to expenses, I'm not going to pay any rent, it's sort of, so they'll make choices to go somewhere else that they believe is a better value, hopefully
Well,
not.
that's very helpful for someone who's a resident trying to get a sense of equity between residential and commercial property.
The other thing that, since it came up, that I'm asking you to look at, which could have an impact on current or revenue going forward, is to make sure that this is mostly for the larger properties, that the structured parking is not being assessed, and to make sure that that's being done consistently. So that could potentially have a negative revenue impact if we find that there are properties that have been assessed their structured parking, but just weren't aware or didn't protest it. Or
I
didn't
find that
question
hard to
it.
believe they weren't aware.
Well, yeah, it'd be great, because then they,
But, if we do find those parcels, we would then be backing, that square footage out, and that could have an issue. So there's that. So so keep some of these numbers in mind, because the next thing to look at is this sheet here. It's like this. There's a couple of different things on this. The first thing that I did is, the guts of this table came out of the presentation that was done at the end of, I think, of December to council, when they were really looking kind of in general that this is an issue and what can be done. So, based upon our last meeting, there was discussion around from MBS that recent case law indicate that residents cannot be exempted from PBIT assessment district because they do receive the same special benefit as a business parcel. So that may not be a reason to exclude them. And so for the renewal, it might be prudent just for that basis to include the residents. And certainly including all residents would address some of the equity issues that people brought up, either some of the commercial properties brought up, or even some of the residential properties brought up, in that some are paying, some residents are paying, and some aren't.
And would it be all residents in the city or just in the PBIT district itself?
The PBIT is citywide.
Oh, it is citywide.
It is citywide. And actually, the way the engineer did it the last time, there's a lien against every parcel in the city unless we specifically exempted it. It's just that if it's residential, the amount of the assessment is zero. So under this scenario, we would go back to, every parcel would be assessed, though, unless there's some carve-outs. And then,
And, sorry, just real quick, but what the engineer also mentioned, under the changes in PBID laws, you can also do the zones.
yes.
So,
Yeah.
Well, they were talking about like how far you are from the
Right,
roots and stuff like
right,
that,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Right, and so what I'm presenting you really is, it's assuming that, let's say, 2015, there's no increases in the PBID at all, which that's really happened. And then I did kind of a scenario of some different scenarios of assessing residential units. So the first is the $127.70 per unit that exists now. The next would be assessing all residential units, 100 units, which of course for some would be less than they're paying now, but you're still capturing a larger universe, and one would be 80. There is approximately 6,300 or so residential units in the city.
Say that again,
I think
please.
it's 6,360 to be exact.
Yeah.
And yes, 6,360 right there. And currently 1,500 paid to the PBIT. And what I just did is I looked at, I took the dollar amount of the residential and I divided by 127.7 and came up with that number. And so again, I said, this is really for discussion. This is not something, we would do a full parcel analysis. And certainly if we start looking at other equity issues related to service levels or carve-outs, all of this could change. And you certainly could, for example, if the feeling was that there were parts of, if, for example, North Hollis, or if, for example, east of San Pablo Avenue is not getting quite the service as maybe Shell now, you could make some choices there. We could do some finer grading of the different land uses between the commercial. Maybe retail should not be paying the same as office, which they do now. These are all
Open
discussions.
that one up, that'll be interesting.
That's true. It's very interesting. And these are all kind of issues that are not necessarily, I think, for this group. It's really for the TMA to have that discussion, because it's really the people who would be assessed who kind of decide what's in that management plan to some degree, or have input into that, because obviously you want it to pass. And so if there's not some, not consensus, but some agreement among many of the different sectors, then, you're not gonna go and ask the parcels to vote for something that you know that quite a few would be dead set against.
There was a discussion I had with Joe once,
Ah, yes.
and
I wish Joe was here today.
that's, well, I'll
Good.
bring it up. He called me out of the, from memory, because he was on the planning commission at the time, and he knew John and I and Lathrop founded it. The idea was twofold. One, it was a huge benefit to bring this city into the modern era, because it had been deleted from BART. There was no way to get to BART, and AC Transit's a tragedy. It never served the city, in our opinion back then, my opinion right now. And so we had a couple of goals. Part of it, old man Lathrop said, I don't want to give up the Watergate shuttle, because he had his system and it worked and he controlled it. And by going to a city benefit, it was supposed to include residential and commercial and growth in the retail, of course. And there was great success, so like everything else that has success, you have to iterate it and evolve it to take into an account what's going on. I think the latest efforts that have been made, and the TMA's done a wonderful job, the residents have done a wonderful job in shining a light on this issue. And Joe and I talked, and he said, well, Rich, you know it was supposed to be a gift back to the community. And I said, yes, it was, absolutely in part. But part of it was also to be, when it got legitimized and it got up and running, it was supposed to be tinkered with and evolved on a fair and equitable basis. And I said, the business community should always take the lion's share. But the city was always trying to get itself out of it, so it could run as an independent transit authority. And so Joe brought that up, and I said, certainly. So when I look at this proposal in front of me, to me, it should be important that the whole city's behind this and gets involved, but it should be modest in the residential community. And I certainly agree with what you did here, whereby how far away you are from the use and the service, it would be, I think, much more compelling to go to the residential community and saying, well, you're this far away, 80, you're this far away, 100, you're this far away, you have this usership, 127, and then have certain kind of projections where you could cap this thing. Because the public is tired of always saying yes to something and then being whipsawed from behind in future years. And so I think that element, that mechanism has to be in place as well. But going back to Joe and I's discussion, there was no question when we first formulated it. It was supposed to be a benefit for the entire city that the lion's share ended up with, at the time, was Lathrop, Chiron, and Wareham. And we had, as I said, for 3 years, Karen and Cassie Ganger Wareham ran the transit authority out of an office. But it's grown, and its success has also showed you how much demand there is in the community. You have so many information points and data points that say how successful it is, and the TMA struggles with that growth. So I think the most important issue that should come from this committee and then move forward to council is an alignment of interest to look to the future. Because what it's allowed has been a quality of life issue, and not to mention the planet issue and global warming, because whether we like it or not, we'll always fight the Hayward-Richmond traffic. We're going to have to deal with it, and the Emery go-round has been enormously successful in mitigating that use for allowing the benefit to the local community. So I wanted to bring up Joe and I in our discussion because...
Well, Joe would be very forceful on the issue of how to tax residents for contributions.
Right.
No question.
Keep it modest as possible with caps.
One of the issues that I think about, because I don't have disagreements with that, one of the challenges is, you all been there a really long time, but people are constantly making new choices, and the city's going to see it already has a lot of residential development, mostly focused on rentals. They're more on the drawing boards, And to be honest, any rental project can become a homeownership project. I mean, that's happened at Emery Bay. So you don't want to, it would be a shame to protect people who've been here a long time in a way that leaves money off, on the table for people coming in willing. Like a lot of the people who are working on the new apartment projects are very eager to pay in and get service, right? So you don't want to charge them too little because of concerns of people. And, Watergate, if someone new moved into there, is it fair to pass a different levy onto them or not? I mean, those are challenging issues, but you can't say, well, Watergate gets a special deal because we've been here a long time, because not everyone has been a long time, right? So you need to come up with some sort of different nexus, I think, or it'll be sort of us against you, which is not, Rich is saying just the opposite. You want everyone together so they feel that
Has
there's
to be
not
alignment.
inequity.
Look, it is the most important amenity in the city.
But one of the issues too about the homeowner versus the residents, particularly the condos, is that technically, well, if you have to kind of treat people the same way in terms of right now, what's carved out are any parcels that are in a residentially zoned area of the city, whether it's commercial or residential. So that goes away because you're still getting the same kind of thing. Then you go toward, particularly with condos, homeowner versus rental. But we know that there's a lot of condos that convert to being rental because the owner, decides that it's an investment and then they move out and they rent out that condo. Well, technically speaking, that person should have a commercial business license for renting out that property and they should be paying into the payment. But we've not fine-grained it that much. I mean, administratively, that is
Disaster.
a disaster.
Disaster.
So we don't, so if we did that, my guess is, I don't know how much in Watergate, but I've heard that a fair amount of Watergate is actually rental, so.
50%.
Yeah, so technically speaking,
So would that not be a wise thing over time to make sure the city has on its rolls so that all the units would be at least participating?
well, if you don't make a distinction between rental and homeowner, then you don't have that administrative,
It doesn't matter, right?
it doesn't really matter. And administratively, I think it would be very difficult to try to keep that current. Not to mention that we have a lot of residents that don't necessarily the only way you could do it would be by indexing the business license information, and we all know that a lot of people don't even think about the fact that they're renting out their unit, that in fact, they're supposed to have a business license. It's not even that they're doing it intentionally, they don't think about that.
But that's a 2014 project that we're working on.
But it's still,
What year did you say?
a lot of this debate came up because some people raised their hands very big way about equity. And so, the logic of, well, you're different because you rent than you own is a weird argument to have, right? I don't think it leads you a positive way.
Well, can I say that in similar conversations with Joe Lutz, that, because at the last meeting, I think he had come out essentially and said that he thought the residents shouldn't pay. And I said that I said that I was willing to pay. I didn't know if other people were. We've had discussions since then about how many people at Watergate, for example, are actually taking it, because part of the issue becomes that the people who are taking it, well, I don't know anybody who takes it who would really have a problem with paying. The problem is the proportion of people who don't take it at all. And what Joe had said is that he thinks that if it's $127 a unit, that some of the people who are not taking it will not be very happy with it and will not vote for it. But that if the amount was, that if it was citywide and if the amount was lowered, that would be easier for people to swallow. Partially because they're afraid that, we'll go up each year. We get into this thing, it's gonna be 2.5%, 5%, whatever. And so it isn't even so much with the amount you're going in with, so much as what happens to it in 5 years from now.
Well, I think that was the reason I brought that up to you, Karen, and to the city, is if you want the residential community support, in fairness, I would say 3 to 5 years, cap whatever that rate is, so that there's some clarity, because there's a great deal of distrust whenever government's involved. We all have.
I think a lot of that is going to be, some of this is going to have to come out of the engineer's legal analysis of what you can do within an assessment district. And, and the amount paid is supposed to be based upon something, and something, so I think really for this group is to kind of in concept, to kind of see, is to understand that this would maybe be the foundation, that would be a renewal of the PBID with residents included, and that as a further step, we would be looking into the specifics about, I know our ABS is talking about addressing this issue of general versus specific, though the way we're doing it now, that might be lessened. Looking at whether or not things like different benefit zones based upon ridership and route frequency, if that would make sense. If it makes sense to review land use, that to me is kind of down the road a little bit after there's been kind of some consensus that at least the PBID, including residents, is kind of where we're gonna start. How much the residents, I think definitely hearing the clear message that residents should be paying less. So the question is is being able to support that verbiage in this report in a way that the assessment district isn't able to be challenged. And so I think that would be the further work that we would have to do. Yes, Laura?
So, we had this conversation at the last meeting, and I struggle with this because if it boils down to I'm only paying if I'm using it, that's a ridiculous argument. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous argument. And if it's kind of like, I don't have kids, I'm not paying for the schools. You know what I mean? It's like if we decide that there is a greater good to be had here, and I think we agree that there's a general good to be had here, we can't go to that granularity of like, I'm not paying, I don't use it. So, and we also can't go to the granularity of I'm paying, so I want it to stop at 8:35 because that's when I need it to be here. Like, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but we're hearing that, you know what I mean? So I want to speak to that I think that, if there is a general good to be had, and I think there is general consensus that there is, I certainly think there is, then, we understand that if we're gonna do a PBID, you can't carve people out. It makes sense to look at zones, because if you're on the other side of San Pablo, you're really not close to a route, that's legitimate. And I think it makes sense to look at retail and say you're not really the same as office, but, I think a PBID makes sense, and I've said all along that, there is a general good to be had, and if the Emery go-round went away, it would be a really bad thing for Emeryville.
Well, there's
I agree with
specific, that
yeah.
if you as a resident can get on a free shuttle to Guthrie Park, it is a specific, whether you use it or not is a different story. But you still have that special benefit that you have the ability to do that.
And
it also
is
increases
reflected
property
here.
values.
I mean,
So
the
you get
businesses
some
are still
benefit.
paying huge lion's share of the total, so.
I'm not saying they shouldn't, Lauren, I'm
Yeah.
just telling you, I'm just repeating.
No, I get that.
But Betsy, your point's well taken, because they still vote, and they're gonna be
Yeah.
for my
That's right.
That's right.
Exactly.
But you know what, there are ways to deal around that, and to your point. You can buy radiuses, which is how we formulated it to
Yeah.
begin with.
Yeah.
Say, who should pay, maybe there's a sliding scale there. My sense though is, and you guys have been doing the heavy lifting, we look out 3 years with added buses, with 1 or 2 lines more. What is our cost gonna be? Figure that in. You can't have perfection. I'm counting on the audit bringing money so you don't have that negative 195 touching our reserve, because that shouldn't happen. And more importantly, once you come out with the formula, the template that council goes with, you tell the community, okay, we have enough courage and confidence, we can cap this for 2 or 3 years at least, maybe longer. We will have to justify in a compelling way any increases that can only come from another oil crisis or another this, if we're idiots enough not to get more natural gas and propane and biofuels in, which we should be doing anyway, but we need new capital to get those type of vehicles.
And you make a good point. I mean, there's no reason to base the budget on current levels. I mean, you have to plan for the future.
And that's when you
Well,
go
so-
to.
So can
so
I
maybe
ask a
it's
question?
good segue.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
You're gonna come up with a staff report, and you're still assembling your thoughts, but I feel like they're really fairly gelled. So are you saying that the only incremental additional source of revenue that you're imagining now is a wider spread residential?
We
Or
haven't finished the discussion.
okay, then please keep going, because that's where I.
So,
Wait, one more point. Talking to residents about shifting some of the burden to residents. One of the things that we need to keep in mind, because some residents will be fully aware of this, over the decades, the city has gone substantially into debt. Redevelopment agency, well borrowed money in my judgment. And that debt costs us, about 7-8 million a year to finance out of the general fund?
Oh, no, not out of the general.
Not out of the general fund.
Yeah, out of the former redevelopment.
Redevelopment,
Yeah.
But will those savings accrue all to the city or partially?
That's what I'm
Because
getting.
that's where you're headed, right?
That's where I'm trying to get.
You're saying in terms of the.
Well, if I were a resident, I want to know what the burden and or the payback for that has been over the decades. And so if I'm thinking about voting for an increase in funding for Emeryville as a resident, then I want to know where I stand with these other issues.
This
So I'm
funded
just-
out of the incremental property tax, and there's money that's set aside, once redevelopment is eliminated, there's essentially a trust fund for the purposes of bond repayment.
It's at the top, so it's
It
all
doesn't hit your
former.
general fund at all.
Okay,
No, but what it does do is it's, I guess the other framing of it, in the absence of those bonds, yes, the general fund
You would get the
would be
money.
getting 22 cents back on its dollar right now.
And
Yeah.
once they're
But-
repaid, you will get 22.
That's right,
That-
30 years from now,
Yeah.
whatever it is. But no, but right now it's not hitting the general fund. It's all former,
well, that's good news. And that cuts a negative argument off of the kneecaps.
okay.
Well, so Karen, go.
Okay, so if you, so what I did when I did this chart is I looked at kind of the blue line is essentially the additional money that would be generated by including residents. The line above it is that there's already the 1,500 units, so that's not additional money. So if you look at the additional money, you know, it's between, you know, it varies from essentially it's 6, 5, and 4, more or less. And if you look at just the projections for next year, and you start looking at the projections, not including additional, what might be later on, that is perhaps enough, you know, to cover it, but it's pretty close. And
Well,
it doesn't, right, and
Your
what I would,
capital needs are gonna be.
right, and I would
enormous
argue
in the
that
next 2
what's
years.
not here is that, is how much money do you really need, so to speak, right, in terms of additional
Our budget
capital.
was just to keep
Exactly,
it going
right.
exactly the way
Or
it
if
is
you
without
want to,
improvement.
No
or
growth,
if you're
no
implementing,
change.
right, if you're implementing some of the route changes that Fair and Pierce are looking at, you know, so this is really, so that's why I said this is just for discussion only. And the takeaway to me is that while including residents does a lot to solve the immediate problem, you know, it may or may not be the only answer, particularly because you need some cushion. You need, you know, all of a sudden you have vacancies that fill up, all of a sudden you have a mode shift and you've got a lot of people, you know, maybe a younger demographic, you know, that takes the, you know, I have a
You
19,
want to
I
encourage
have
a
almost
road shift.
19-year-old and
You want to do
23-year-old
that.
that do not have a driver's license, which
No,
I think
they
is
take it.
insane.
And that's why the apartments will. But
Yeah.
again, and the other thing missing here is this, the audit information. It could be that we have 6 figures, serious 6 figures, that by whatever reason has been missed and not put into the pot. And all that, it'd be great if you could accelerate that study. So
End of April.
there's no way they can do it sooner? It's
I-
been great.
They at first said the end of June.
There's some strong arming that we're working on.
Yeah,
Don't
we're
worry,
strong arming.
We're not being very,
I think that's gonna be, first of all, it's gonna make everybody in the community feel better that you have clarity.
Yes.
Because you don't want any questions out there when we're talking about funding.
Right now it's the end of
That's a good
April, and I have said to get it before the April 22nd council meeting would be optimal.
But in my mind, going back to what the report said is, the budget, I always look 2 years ahead. And so if we're looking 2 years ahead, you can be darn sure that we're gonna need several $100,000 more than we currently have in. And if that gets us 1 or 2 more buses, kind buses, by the way, but, and that we get at least another route because of the changes of the existing apartment complexes that are now being built or trying to be approved.
And certainly another chunk of work that has to be done with the TMA is to come up with kind of a budget that builds upon the information we already know, information that's in the current study, and then builds into that the current development. So we get like a real kind of, let's say, with the next 5 year, what would be a plausible budget, because then that's the number that we would know to maintain service quality
Has to be
and the
looked at,
standards,
To
what,
tell the
what,
people
what
that
that
count.
number is. And so, you know, I don't know that all of that will be through the P-bid, particularly if you're, you know, being aware of people's, you know, you want to get it passed, so to speak, so you don't want to put it so much into the P-bid that you have perhaps maybe even major property owners saying, well, I can run a private shell cheaper, right? So.
And those discussions are coming up.
Listen, they all can.
Yes.
So you're never gonna get an argument that this is the cheapest way. You gotta have them believe in the greater good way.
But
Right.
there is
Yeah.
a dollar amount that you say.
Yeah, there's some base, right, but.
There's another source of income that I hesitate to throw out, but since we have 2 voices here that will respond, we have to start thinking about metering in certain key streets. That's a source of income. We have a technology with a credit card these days that people don't have to carry 14 quarters. You know, we have some very busy streets that should be looked at.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That is a project coming before the end of the
2014?
calendar year.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
She's got a lot under
There's a lot
2014.
going on.
Faster, faster.
So that segues. Now, that was actually one thing that came up earlier, was dedicating Parker meeting space. That you could, if you put a parking meter program, is essentially see that as a revenue stream for transportation projects, including the Emery around. So that is something, you know, that was on the list before. What I have done now, was spend the last part of the meeting talking about, is that in addition to looking at the P-bid revenue, is that there is information around property tax, transfer taxes. And so some information of that, this was right out of information that was provided to the council earlier. About half the cities in Alameda County are charter cities, and only charter cities can have local property transfer tax. That does take a majority vote of the people. At the last council meeting, there was a unanimous decision of the city council
A miracle.
to to initiate the process toward placing a city charter on the November 4th ballot, which is, you may go down in history of being able to do that.
Do this quickly.
Do that.
Yes.
We're working very hard. So April 22nd, staff will be coming to council with a preliminary draft and hope to receive some final direction from council then. And then we return to council on May 6th with potentially final language for voter consideration. I guess there is the option of having a special meeting after that if it takes one more. But essentially, there has to be final language done by May 20th in order to make the deadlines for that for November 4th. So, assuming that it's at the same time as that, the council will also be considering whether to do a transfer tax at the same time, which they would have to be done at the same time, because if the city charter doesn't pass, then the local transfer tax is moot, because you can't have one if you're not a charter city. And so just to give you some information about that, every city in Alameda County that is a charter city does have a local property transfer tax. It is not considered a tax on property. It's essentially kind of like a document tax. It's, you know, it's on the transaction, not on the, but it's based upon the assessed value of the property. And so it goes from a low of $4.50 in Hayward up to a high of $15 per thousand in Berkeley and Oakland. And so, gives you just some basic information of what that would generate, general law versus local, some recent major property sales. Now, there's kind of what I call, it's not really background noise, may not be the best term, but kind of your baseline, right? And that's kind of any typical year, you know, you get a sense of there's things that turn over. And then some years, you get a big turnover. So, some recent major property sales to give you kind of a sense of what you received, because general law cities get half of $1.10 that's assessed, the county getting 55 cents and the city getting 55 cents. So you can see, you know, there's certainly some outliers here. The towers in Louvartis being the biggest ones. The next,
What is the county, what's the nexus for the county getting a share of this
Just
windfall?
always do. They push paper.
And so is
They
there
have
any, if
documents.
you give them that benefit, is there any way to get a greater commitment from them? I mean, because it seems
Are
sort
you
of
kidding?
bizarre.
it's state law, it's state
Well,
law.
Yeah.
You're never gonna get a dime from them on that.
No.
There were efforts in the past to change state law on that note, in which went.
Well, I don't mean that you keep it, I mean you just see a greater diversion
Benefit,
back.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I wish.
It's one of their greatest revenue sources.
But I mean, they're not lobbying for, I mean, right, they're
No,
not
they're
an
not
active
lobbying to change
participant
it.
in trying to create this revenue stream, right, so.
Well, and counties are creatures, counties are creatures of the state, to the extent that the counties get less than the state would have to deal with that shortfall, and
Yeah.
they have no incentive to do so. So the last table on this is going back to 2009, the value of property sales in Emeryville, our 55 cents and what that generated, and then looking at kind of a $12 one, which is kind of in the middle, the $15, which would be the max currently done in Alameda County, and then the lowest, which is Hayward. And we haven't done the analysis to kind of see what we would say would be a base, but I think what this does, it gives you kind of a sense. So 2010 is obviously in the middle of the recession, that was when the property bubble burst. So that to me kind of gives you a sense of maybe what would be a minimum here.
So what would be the drawback of being a charter city?
Yeah, what else is involved besides?
Is there a
property?
fee on
I
the
would-
cost?
I wouldn't say it's a drawback, but I
Well, I
would
know how
say-
you feel, but I mean,
No, in some charter cities in the past, the openness, the ability to really manage your own funds and generate revenue has resulted in enormously inflated prices for city officials and so forth. It has led to abuse, in effect, of the revenue stream for all kinds of local dealings. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I certainly hope it wouldn't happen in Emeryville.
And one difference is that right now, either the city council or the residents of ballot initiative, there is a limited area of taking action, right? And once you're a charter city, there is a greater sphere of what either the city council or the
Can make
residents
laws
can make laws about.
Outside the purview.
Exactly.
And
That's
so,
what-
you know, that can be
that's what
positive,
I'm saying.
but, you know, given the initiative process, or, you know, that also can lead to the passing of measures that, you know, that some people think that some of the measures that curtail revenue or kind of take the ability to spend money out of the council's hands, and it, you know, has not necessarily been wise for cities like Oakland.
Right, exactly.
And so, you know,
Hypothetically.
hypothetically, right, and so the ability as a charter city for your residents to do that is a potential.
true, but one thing that we could do is when you're writing this up for the voters, we agree to a transparency of benefits and salaries to take some of the sting out of what occurred,
The
particularly.
difference is that even if your charter limits you, it can always be expanded through a charter amendment, which is a higher threshold than a regular ballot measure. But essentially, once you're a charter, you always can have access to all the authorities of the charter. The difference is whether it's through simple ordinance ballot measure, or whether it's through the charter amendment process.
You know what?
But I mean, but that's
To
just,
me,
that's just
I
the
think it's
difference.
insane the city doesn't get transfer taxes.
There's definitely been the direction unanimously from the council to go forward. The question just was, that is one of the issues that have caused some cities not to do it. So it gives you a sense of, so to me, if you look at a minimal amount, and you can get some sense of what that could add to the city's coffers. Now, of course, if this was a transfer tax that was done solely to benefit the Emeryville, which I don't think would be staff's recommendation, then it would be a 2/3 vote. If it's a transfer tax that just goes into the general fund and then the council has the ability to, of course, make a determination of where those funds go, then it's a simple majority. So that kind of gives you some sense of what that could generate. And then the other issue that came up was transit occupancy tax, and 1% versus a 2% increase. And that goes back to this sheet, just to give you a sense of what that could generate. And I don't know if you had an opportunity. Yeah, then there's also the possibility of increasing the utility users tax, and we haven't had a chance yet to back into that number. But essentially, all these are varying ways in adding to that potentially a parking meter program in which additional revenue could be brought into the general fund, and then the council could vote as part of the budget process to put that into the Emeryville every year. Now, certainly, it's not earmarked for the Emeryville, but I think from staff's point of view, maybe I'm speaking for myself, is that it allows a variance, right? That that it allows that if there isn't money needed, perhaps, that there's not as much money allocated. It also provides the opportunity, if there is a temporary need to increase, you can do that as well, as opposed to having kind of a dedicated stream, which that kind of, that maybe flexibility is not there. So any of these, the transfer tax or any of these, the earliest that they could be put on the books really would be for the 14-15 tax year. It would require voter approval November 2014, and I believe, and then that way, I believe it could be on the, maybe the 15-16 tax year. Yeah, it would be on the 15-16 tax year. So that would be the fastest that those, if it's sorry, confusing. The P-bid, if it is renewed in 15, it would take effect for the 15-16 fiscal year. If there is just a plain tax, oftentimes they take effect January 1st of 2015. And so that would be when those would take effect. And of course, the parking meter program, you first have to put the parking meters in, and that was done.
It's a little ways.
It's a little ways away.
But I think the spirit of the agreement, that whatever council comes up with, has to stipulate what the strategy is going to be and when it gets implemented, so that there's clarity. I can't, look, this started so far back, I can't even remember anymore. But it has been uniformly, I think, one of the great benefits on every level, environmentally, economically, just as an amenity that's allowed the city to have a quality of life, so people are not just in cars stacking off back and forth. And so, speaking personally, I have no problem with property transfer tax. I really think we should support a 1% increase in the hotel tax, because those are visitors coming and going. I think 2% might be a bit excessive and screwing the hotel, but I would just say 1%. I would say the council should agree to implement at key intersections and key streets a metering program, and I think the metering in this hotel tax should be dedicated to the Emeryville, to TMA. And I think that there really has to be much discussion to council to understand that capital improvements in the future are gonna get more and more prohibitive if we're going to keep this successful. That there has to be 5-year plans, 10-year plans,
And a
because,
bus yard.
well, I mean, that's, and we also have to have an audit that makes certain that it's fair and square and a level playing field and people are participating.
And that's the other thing that's not included here is that under the new Keegan law, I don't know if you've heard about this, there is the opportunity to issue bonds
For capital.
for capital.
Well, that would solve a big problem.
Karen, one of the things I don't see yet on the table for discussion, and I know it's a one-shot deal, but there is money from Alameda County for shuttles and transit projects of our type. We know that we couldn't tap into that for operation costs, but I think you and I others have talked about capital investment, the bus yard, leasing of buses and so forth. Is that part of the package we should be thinking
You know,
about?
I think that's something that certainly it's been mentioned before and would be mentioned in the staff report, but it's not guaranteed money. It's part of a grant it's a part of a grant program.
Exactly.
And it's not on a per capita basis that you don't get it just for being. And it's not dedicated for shuttles, it's part of a wider type of programs that would be eligible. And so we don't know when those cycles are, we don't know what the requirements are. I think it is likely that Emeryville would be viewed very favorably.
Well,
But
but I
there's-
think
but
it's
you
a
can't-
transit authority. If the transit authority in concert with the city goes to the county,
That's
it
what-
can get that
See,
money.
that's the,
And to be candid, and I know Ken's an advocate of this big time, we've never gotten our fair share. We've taken an awful lot of people from Oakland, from Berkeley, that utilize this service.
Yep.
And that's okay, because the better good, the greater good is all right. But the county has some obligation to participate in some of the capital improvements to maintain the quality of
And
service.
so
I-
does BART. BART has a shuttle program, and we should be going to that
But
too.
Yeah, I
so-
do believe that if the Emery-go-round would do well in that competitive process.
good,
But because you can't, it's not
Can't
money
count it.
in your hand,
got it. But
right? You can't really budget it.
But we could get a commitment from staff and the city to make a concerted, carefully
Oh,
thought through
absolutely.
effort to go for those grants,
We
help
would-
support Emeryville.
We would even go higher. I think we would go to our congresswoman and to our supervisor and show the compelling arguments of phenomenal success of a transit authority that deserves to be given some special dispensation.
We should really try to get every dime we can from County Alameda.
Yes. And I have no doubt that will happen. But again, we can't budget that because,
I understand.
but yeah, but that will be said in the staff report that there are some other possible funding options for capital that would be pursued, but again, it's not guaranteed.
Do
Just
you
like,
think, Betsy, if this program based on radiuses of use and accessibility in a modest way went back to the residential community, and there were caps for employers and people saw the clarity and transparency of all of this, it would be received favorably now?
The radius, I'm not sure exactly how that would work, because the way
It
the
doesn't help
stops are set up.
Watergate.
No.
It doesn't
But
help
it's
either.
not just that it doesn't help Watergate, but Pacific Park Plaza and Watergate have, I think it's about probably 30% or 40% of the people who are not already paying into it. And we have stops, but Pacific Park
Yeah,
Plaza has
that's
one right in front, I mean,
It would be mostly east of Santa
Well,
Paula.
the challenge is that you're asking people to vote for it, to pay where they've had the benefit of not, right? That's a hard
Exactly.
request.
and we have had this continual story about, well, just for businesses to, in order to get their development projects through, they agreed to pay for it, and now they're turning around and asking residents, which I've always thought that it was interesting that the residents weren't having to pay anything for it, so I don't have any problem with it.
at the
But I
time,
think
residents
that-
could not.
Right, no, I understand that, but most people don't, most people have not been going to the TMA meetings, they don't know anything all about PBID, and so, if you go to, if a large enough group of people are not using the bus, and a lot of the people, they drive to work, they, for various reasons, they don't use it, will they vote for it? I don't know, but if you make it a low enough figure, and I don't know what the figure is, Joe has had different theories about figures that he thinks would float, you know, where people would say, oh, that's great, we'll all pay, and there wouldn't be any resistance at all.
But he's guessing.
He's guessing, exactly.
So the principle is, when dealing with the problem that he's responding to here, is keep that request as low as absolutely possible, and yet have it do a little bit of good for the everybody.
Because I think that the residents are probably not gonna end up paying the majority of it anyway. The majority of it's still gonna be paid for by the businesses. But if you can come up with a figure that's a significant amount that makes a difference in paying for it and is not high enough that people, to me, $127, I think that's pretty reasonable, but some people
$12
don't.
or so a month, but.
In other
It's
words,
$10 a month.
That's right.
calculate,
Yeah, but some people, that's a problem, and there are a number of people, at Watergate, for example, who really are in financial distress, because there are a lot of retired people, when the economy dropped, a lot of people lost their jobs. Every month you see that, you know, units are being, sold for, you know, for closure, because, people just aren't making it. I mean, there aren't a lot of them, but there are several, and,
Yeah,
So-
those are some of the things that potentially, you know, assuming that it's legal to do so, that could be a carve out. I mean,
Yeah.
senior exemptions for parcel taxes are pretty common, you know.
well,
and-
that's another thing
And
that
for
I had occurred to
PBID, for
me.
example, already the senior housing, affordable senior housing was exempted on the grounds that because they have the paratransit program, that they don't get this, you know, they're not getting as much of a special benefit because they have programs specifically tailored for their needs.
Just be mindful it has to be administered, right?
Right, no, I agree.
Well, no, the school parcel tax has a senior exemption.
But you
and I
have to
think-
file for it, so.
I think you
Yeah,
have to be
yeah,
over
yeah.
6,500, but you have to actually actively file for it each year. And I can
Yeah,
tell
so
you that
would
most,
make a difference.
the number of the people that I've talked to, most of them do not file for it. I'm eligible for it, I do not file for it. I know many people who are eligible who don't
But
file
you
for
could.
it. But it's sort of a little reassurance, you know, okay, you're
That it's
getting
there.
old, you're not really sure what your finances are. At some point, you know, you might want to. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that, you know, if the Emery program ceased to exist, all the people who don't use it and drive to work would be competing with, you saw thousands of people and would also be driving.
Yeah,
In
and
general,
it'll be a
use
mess for the city if it isn't.
What's your definition of a senior, Janet?
Okay, so I'm gonna.
And the
What age? I want to know what age.
the parcel tax, I think, is 65.
I'm kidding. You know, no.
Well, I think you've got it. It's gotta be reliable or the TMA can't function.
Yeah.
If it's, we're gonna hope to get a big windfall next year, but we won't know, you can't run it. The benefit has been that it has a reliable, sort of uninterruptible base of income that it uses 100% plus of to provide service.
So, as you know, that this is considered a staff level committee, and so, it's really input for staff. And, does anyone feel that additional input is needed at this point, or is that people feel that that they've been heard, and that the next step really is for staff to come up with what we'll be bringing to council?
Good luck.
Well, since Sabrina, Sabrina's already told us everything's getting done in 2014.
I personally am happy with.
So you have, so, and another, I think you can see kind of what staff's thoughts are, exactly what we're gonna recommend, we still need to discuss, but you, I think, know enough about,
No surprises.
no.
All
See you later.
All of the above.
Thank you.
Great, so, thank you very much for serving